The evening sun cast long shadows across the bustling street where the Golden Spoon restaurant stood proud, its warm lights beckoning hungry patrons inside. For 30 years, Mr. Chen had poured his heart and soul into this establishment, transforming it from a modest family diner into one of the city's most beloved restaurants. His weathered hands told stories of countless hours spent in the kitchen, perfecting recipes passed down through generations. That Friday evening started like any other. The restaurant hummed with the familiar sounds of clinking plates and cheerful conversation. Mr. Chen watched from behind the counter as his staff gracefully navigated between tables, delivering steaming plates of his signature dishes. His eyes crinkled with pride, this was everything he had ever dreamed of. But then they walked in, a young couple, their clothes slightly worn but clean, holding hands as they tentatively approached the host stand. The young woman's eyes sparkled as she took in the elegant decor, while her partner nervously fingered something in his pocket. They weren't the restaurant's usual clientele, but Mr. Chen had always believed good food should be for everyone. The couple was seated at a cozy corner table, and they spent an unusually long time studying the menu. Mr. Chen noticed them whispering, pointing at prices, and counting something under the table. His decades of experience told him something wasn't quite right. When their server approached to take their order, the young man cleared his throat and ordered the least expensive items on the menu, a bowl of soup to share and a side of bread. Mr. Chen felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He'd seen this before, young couples trying to make special moments work within tight budgets. But tonight, something about their demeanor struck him differently. The young man kept reaching for his pocket, his face a mix of nervousness and determination that went beyond typical first-date jitters. As Mr. Chen contemplated the situation, he noticed the young woman discreetly wiping away a tear when her partner wasn't looking. Years of reading people told him this wasn't just another couple trying to dine beyond their means, there was more to their story. But his restaurant had strict policies, and he'd learned the hard way that making exceptions often led to complications. Making his way to their table, Mr. Chen straightened his apron and put on his most professional expression. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "but we have a minimum order requirement per person." He watched as the couple's faces fell, their dreams of a special evening crumbling before his eyes. The young man started to stand, his hands still clutching whatever was in his pocket, but Mr. Chen wasn't finished speaking. What happened next would shake the very foundation of everything Mr. Chen thought he knew about running his restaurant. As he opened his mouth to continue, a glint of metal caught his eye, something that would change not just this evening, but the lives of everyone involved. The young man's hand emerged from his pocket, and in that moment, Mr. Chen realized he'd completely misread the situation. What he saw made his heart stop, and the words died in his throat. This wasn't at all what he had expected, and the truth would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about judging others based on appearances. In that frozen moment, Mr. Chen saw what the young man had been nervously guarding in his pocket, a small velvet box containing a modest but beautiful engagement ring. The young man's face flushed red with embarrassment as he quickly tried to hide it again, but it was too late. The sight of that ring transported Mr. Chen back 30 years, to when he was in the same position, barely able to afford a proper dinner to propose to his own wife. "I've been saving for 6 months, the young man whispered, his voice trembling. "This is where we first met, she was a waitress here during college, and I was a regular customer who could only afford coffee. I wanted tonight to be perfect, but—" His voice trailed off as he looked down at the simple soup they'd ordered to share. The young woman reached across the table and squeezed his hand, tears welling up in her eyes. "I told you we should have just gone to the park," she said softly, but her voice held no judgment, only love. Mr. Chen learned they were both working entry-level jobs, trying to build a future together while paying off student loans. Something shifted in Mr. Chen's heart as he watched them. He saw himself and his late wife reflected in their eyes, the same dreams, the same struggles, the same pure love that had nothing to do with fancy restaurants or expensive meals. He remembered how his wife had always told him that their humble beginnings made their success so much sweeter. Without saying a word, Mr. Chen turned and walked back to the kitchen. The couple began gathering their things, assuming they were being asked to leave. But Mr. Chen had something else in mind. He spoke quietly to his head chef, then to the sommelier, and finally to his daughter who helped manage the restaurant's special events. What happened next would become a story told and retold by the restaurant staff for years to come. But more importantly, it would teach Mr. Chen a lesson about judgment, love, and the true meaning of hospitality that would transform not just his business, but his entire approach to life. As he emerged from the kitchen, carrying not their simple soup but something entirely different, Mr. Chen's eyes gleamed with a plan that would make this evening unforgettable for everyone involved. Sometimes, he realized, the most important moments in life come disguised as challenges, testing not just our judgment, but our capacity for kindness and understanding. Mr. Chen returned to the young couple's table carrying a silver tray laden with his restaurant's finest dishes. The aroma of his signature honey-glazed duck filled the air, accompanied by delicate dim sum and steaming jasmine tea served in his most precious porcelain teapot, the one his wife had brought from their homeland many years ago. "Tonight," he announced softly, placing the dishes before them, "you are my special guests." His daughter appeared beside him, uncorking a bottle of champagne that had been saving for a truly meaningful occasion. As she poured 2 glasses, she shared with them how her own parents had started their life together with barely enough money for a proper meal. The young woman's eyes widened as she took in the spread before them, while her partner began to protest, "Sir, we can't possibly afford," but Mr. Chen raised his hand gently to stop him. "Young man, 30 years ago, I was in your shoes. My wife and I started this restaurant with nothing but dreams and determination. She always said that love deserves to be celebrated properly." Mr. Chen's voice grew softer as he continued, "She passed away 5 years ago, but she taught me that true wealth isn't just about money, it's about recognizing love and nurturing it when we see it." He gestured to the ring box that was still visible in the young man's jacket. "This is my gift to you both, not just the meal, but a reminder that every great love story deserves a beautiful beginning." Other diners in the restaurant had begun to notice the special attention being paid to the corner table. The atmosphere in the entire restaurant shifted as they watched the scene unfold. Mr. Chen's regular customers, many of whom had been coming to his restaurant for years, smiled knowingly. They had all experienced his kindness in different ways, but this moment was something extraordinary. As Mr. Chen turned to leave the couple to their special moment, his daughter caught his arm and whispered something in his ear that made him pause. There was more to this evening's story than even he realized, a connection that would prove just how small and interconnected their world truly was. What his daughter had to share would turn this already emotional evening into something even more remarkable. Mr. Chen's daughter gently pulled him aside, her eyes shining with recognition as she explained. The young woman at the table wasn't just any former waitress, she had been more than an employee during her time at the Golden Spoon. On quiet evenings, she would sit with Mrs. Chen, learning to fold dumplings and listening to stories about the restaurant's early days. She had been there during Mrs. Chen's final months, often staying late after her shifts to keep the elderly woman company while she sorted through old recipe cards. "Dad," his daughter whispered, "don't you remember? She was the one who helped organize all of Mom's handwritten recipes into that beautiful cookbook we use now. She spent weeks translating everything, making sure none of Mom's special notes were lost." Mr. Chen's hands trembled as the memories flooded back. In his grief after losing his wife, he had somehow forgotten this crucial detail. The young woman had been more than just an employee, she had helped preserve Mrs. Chen's legacy, ensuring that her culinary wisdom would live on. Mr. Chen remembered now how his wife would always say, "That girl has the same light in her eyes that I had when I was young." He hadn't made the connection earlier because she had changed her hair, grown more confident, but the gentle spirit was still the same. As this realization washed over him, Mr. Chen noticed something else. The restaurant had grown quieter, but not with awkward silence. Instead, the atmosphere had transformed into one of anticipation. Regular customers who knew the story of Mrs. Chen were watching with knowing smiles. The staff, many of whom had worked there for years, were discreetly wiping away tears as they continued their service. Mr. Chen stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by how perfectly everything had aligned. This wasn't just about a young couple trying to create a special moment, this was about family, legacy, and the kind of love that transcends time and circumstances. But even as he processed this beautiful connection, he didn't realize that the evening held one more surprise that would touch everyone in the restaurant in an unexpected way. As the evening's emotions swirled through the restaurant, an elderly couple seated near the window caught Mr. Chen's attention. They had been quietly observing everything unfold, and now the elderly woman was dabbing her eyes with a napkin while her husband held her hand. They were long-time customers who had celebrated their own 50th wedding anniversary at the Golden Spoon just last month. The elderly woman slowly rose from her seat and approached Mr. Chen, her voice soft but clear. "Your wife would be so proud," she said, squeezing his hand. "You know, 30 years ago, another restaurant owner showed the same kindness to us. We were young and broke, and he turned our awkward evening into a beautiful memory." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "That restaurant was right here, before it was the Golden Spoon. The owner then gave us a chance, just like you're doing now." Mr. Chen's heart skipped a beat. He had bought this location from a retiring restaurant owner 3 decades ago, but he had never known this story. The elderly woman continued, "We've been coming here ever since, watching you build this place into something special. When we saw that young couple tonight, we recognized ourselves in them immediately." The elderly gentleman joined his wife, pulling something from his wallet, a faded photograph of a young couple standing in front of the restaurant's entrance, the sign above them reading Lucky Star Cafe. The black and white image had yellowed with age, but the joy on the young couple's faces was timeless. It was the same spot where the Golden Spoon's entrance now stood. As other regular customers gathered around to see the photograph, the restaurant buzzed with a new energy. Stories began to flow, of first dates, proposals, anniversaries, all celebrated within these walls under different names but with the same spirit of love and hospitality. But while everyone was caught up in sharing memories, they didn't notice that the young couple in the corner had overheard everything, and they were about to add their own surprising chapter to this remarkable chain of events. The young man stood up from his corner table, still holding his girlfriend's hand. His voice shook slightly as he addressed the room, but his words carried clearly through the now quiet restaurant. "I never planned to share this tonight," he began, "but after hearing everyone's stories, it feels right." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. "When I was growing up," he continued, "my grandfather used to tell me about the best meal he ever had. He was a construction worker who helped rebuild this neighborhood after the big storm 50 years ago. One cold evening, exhausted and hungry, he stopped at a small restaurant called Lucky Star Cafe. He couldn't afford much, but the owner insisted on serving him a full meal, saying, 'Those who build our community deserve to be taken care of.'" The elderly couple gasped softly. They had been regular customers at Lucky Star during that exact period. The young man unfolded the paper, revealing a faded receipt from Lucky Star Cafe, dated exactly 50 years ago. "My grandfather kept this receipt his whole life as a reminder of kindness. When he passed away last year, he left me 2 things, this receipt and his mother's wedding ring, telling me to use them both when I found the right person and the right moment." The young woman beside him squeezed his hand tighter, tears flowing freely now. She looked at Mr. Chen and said softly, "When I worked here, Mrs. Chen used to tell me stories about Lucky Star's owner, how he sold them the restaurant at a price they could afford, how he taught them his special recipes, how he believed in them when banks wouldn't give them a loan. She said their success was built on his kindness, and that's why she always insisted on helping others whenever possible." Mr. Chen steadied himself against a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the connections being revealed. The restaurant had fallen completely silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary. But even as these revelations settled over the room, another surprising turn of events was about to unfold, one that would prove that some things in life truly do come full circle in the most remarkable ways. The elderly gentleman who had shared the old photograph suddenly leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the faded receipt in the young man's hands. "May I?" he asked softly, reaching out. When the young man passed him the receipt, his hands trembled as he studied the signature at the bottom. The restaurant fell silent as tears began rolling down his weathered cheeks. "This signature," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "it's my father's handwriting." He looked up at his wife, who had covered her mouth in astonishment. "My father owned Lucky Star Cafe before he sold it to start a new life in another city. I was just a boy then, but I remember him always telling me that a restaurant isn't just about food, it's about giving people a place to create memories." The elderly man turned to Mr. Chen, his voice growing stronger. "When my wife and I came here 30 years ago, we didn't know this had been my father's restaurant. We had just moved back to the city, and I didn't recognize the place with its new name. But now I understand why I've always felt so at home here. The spirit of kindness my father believed in never left these walls." Mr. Chen's daughter, who had been quietly listening, suddenly rushed to her office. She returned moments later carrying a dusty old ledger she had found while organizing the restaurant's storage room years ago. Opening it carefully, she revealed pages of handwritten notes, customer stories, special occasions, and acts of kindness documented by Lucky Star's original owner. As she began reading entries aloud, the connection between past and present grew even stronger. There, in faded ink, was an entry about a tired construction worker who came in from the cold, and how serving him a warm meal had reminded the owner of his own father's struggles. The entry ended with words that echoed through time, "Today's kindness becomes tomorrow's legacy." But as the room absorbed these incredible revelations, the young woman at the corner table stood up, her hands clutching something she had retrieved from her purse. What she was about to share would bring this evening's chain of serendipitous connections to an astonishing culmination that no one could have anticipated. The young woman's hands shook as she carefully pulled an old envelope from her purse. Inside was a yellowed letter, its creases deep from years of being folded and unfolded. "During my last week working here," she began, her voice soft but clear, "Mrs. Chen gave me this letter. She made me promise not to open it until I found true love. I've been carrying it with me for 3 years, waiting for the right moment." With trembling fingers, she opened the letter for the first time. As she began to read Mrs. Chen's elegant handwriting aloud, the restaurant fell into a reverent silence. "My dear girl," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you found someone who makes your heart sing the way my beloved did mine. When you worked beside me in the kitchen, I saw in you the same spirit that built this restaurant, one of love, dedication, and unwavering kindness." Tears streamed down her face as she continued reading. "In the bottom drawer of my old desk, there's a small red box. Inside is a jade pendant that my mother gave me when I married. It has been passed down through generations of strong women in my family. I have no daughters of my own, but in you, I found the daughter of my heart. The pendant is yours now, to wear on your wedding day." Mr. Chen's daughter immediately rushed to the office, knowing exactly which desk her mother meant. When she returned holding a small, worn red box, her hands were trembling. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay a beautiful jade pendant, its green depths holding decades of love stories. The elderly woman who had shared her own Lucky Star Cafe story earlier gasped softly. "I remember your wife wearing that pendant every special occasion," she said to Mr. Chen. "She once told me it gave her strength during the hard times when you were just starting out." As Mr. Chen carefully lifted the pendant from its box, memories of his wife flooded back, her gentle smile as she worked in the kitchen, her quiet strength during their struggles, her unwavering belief in the power of kindness. But even as this precious gift from the past emerged to bridge generations, one final revelation was about to unfold, a twist of fate that would prove that love, in all its forms, has a way of coming full circle in the most beautiful ways. The young man rose from his seat, no longer nervous but filled with a quiet confidence. He walked to the center of the restaurant and gently asked his girlfriend to join him. As she stood beside him, wearing Mrs. Chen's jade pendant, he finally pulled out the ring box he'd been holding onto all evening. But before he could speak, he looked at Mr. Chen and asked softly, "Would you do us the honor of sharing your wife's favorite blessing? The one she used to say at special moments?" Mr. Chen felt his heart swell with emotion. Even after 3 years, this young woman remembered such a small detail about his beloved wife. He stepped forward, placed one hand on each of their shoulders, and began reciting the blessing his wife had shared countless times over the years. "May your love be like good food, simple yet nourishing, growing richer with time, and always shared with others." As the young man knelt down to propose, the elderly couple who had shared their Lucky Star Cafe story began humming the same traditional love song that had played during their own proposal 50 years ago. Other longtime customers joined in, creating a gentle melody that filled the restaurant with warmth and memory. The young woman's "yes" was met with joyful tears and applause from everyone present. Mr. Chen's daughter brought out a special dessert her mother had created years ago for celebration moments, served on the restaurant's very first set of plates, simple ceramic dishes that had witnessed countless moments of joy within these walls. The elderly gentleman who had discovered his father's signature on the old receipt raised his glass in a toast, to Lucky Star, to the golden spoon, to the power of kindness that flows through generations, and to love that turns strangers into family. Later that evening, after the celebrations had wound down and the last customers were leaving, Mr. Chen sat quietly at the corner table where it had all begun. He pulled out his wife's old recipe book, now carefully preserved with the young woman's translations, and opened to the last page. There, in his wife's handwriting, was a note he'd never noticed before: "Remember, my love, our restaurant is more than a business, it's a place where kindness creates miracles. Every person who walks through our door carries their own story, their own dreams. Our job is not just to feed their bodies, but to nourish their hopes." Mr. Chen smiled, understanding now that what had started as a simple evening had become a testament to his wife's wisdom. He had almost turned away a couple for ordering only soup, but instead discovered that sometimes the smallest moments can open the door to the most beautiful connections. From that day forward, the Golden Spoon became known not just for its excellent food, but as a place where love stories were honored, where kindness was served alongside every meal, and where the legacy of 3 generations of restaurant owners lived on in every act of generosity. Mr. Chen placed a new sign near the entrance, bearing words from both Lucky Star's original ledger and his wife's final note: "Enter as strangers, leave as family, where kindness creates miracles." And true to these words, the restaurant continued to weave new stories into its rich tapestry of memories, proving that when we open our hearts to others, even the simplest moments can become extraordinary.